in difference. Then we come up with how we can make a decision on which particular project to accept or reject. So we can just have a brief introduction by summarizing that. We can summarize that it is the required rate of return. It is the required rate of return by investors. It is the required rate of return by investors, by the investors who have provided funds to the company, who have provided the funds to the company, who have provided the funds to the company. They include number one, cost of equity. Number one will be the cost of equity. Number two, cost of the preference shares. Number three, cost of debentures. Number three will be cost of the debentures. So we start off with cost of equity. We start off with the cost of equity. So under the cost of equity, we shall summarize that equity refers to shareholders' funds. Equity refers to the shareholders' funds. Equity refers to the shareholders' funds. And it can be categorized into two as follows. So equity refers to the shareholders' funds, and it can be categorized into two as follows. It can be categorized into two as follows. So Roman letter 1 will be ordinary share capital. Roman letter 1 will be the ordinary share capital. The ordinary share capital. Roman letter 2 will be retained earnings. Roman letter 2 will be the retained earnings. So now we can start with Roman letter 1, ordinary share capital. We can start with the Roman letter 1 as the ordinary share capital. Then under the ordinary share capital, we also summarize that ordinary shares are classified into two as follows. Ordinary shares are classified into two as follows. Ordinary shares are classified into two as follows. So A we can have it as, we can start with M. So A will be 0 dividend. 0 dividend, growth rate ordinary shares. Growth rate ordinary shares. 0 dividend, growth rate ordinary shares. So A will be 0 dividend, growth rate ordinary shares. 0 dividend growth rate ordinary shares. So I would simply be giving you the formulas on how to calculate that cost of the ordinary share, because you already know them. The dividend pattern will remain constant. The dividend will not be able to change. So if that is the case, I'm simply giving you the formula on how to compute the dividend, the cost of the ordinary share in case it is 0 dividend growth rate ordinary shares. So in this case, KE will be the cost of the ordinary share. KE will be the cost of the ordinary share. It will be equal to D divided by PO, D minus F. Then you express it as a percentage. Then we express it as a percentage. So D is the dividend per share. D will be the dividend per share. PO is the current market price per share. PO will be the current market price per share. But F is the flotation cost. Then we express it as a percentage. So to calculate the cost of the ordinary share, when it has 0 dividend growth rate, the KE will be representing the cost for the ordinary share. D is the dividend per share. PO is the current market price per share. Then we minus the flotation cost. Then we express it as a percentage. So when it is 0 dividend, dividend will not change. We just remain the same. So that's now in case of 0 dividend growth rate ordinary share. Then B, we shall have it as constant dividend growth rate ordinary shares. Growth rate ordinary shares. So the next one is supposed to be the constant dividend growth rate ordinary shares. The constant dividend growth rate ordinary shares. So here the dividends will be increasing, but a constant rate. So when it comes to this one, to calculate the cost of the ordinary share, it will be given by dividend in period 0. Then we increase it by the constant growth rate. Then we shall divide by PO is the current market price per share. Then we subtract the flotation cost. Then we also add G at that level. So finally, it will simply be T1 divided by PO minus the flotation cost. Then we add G at that level. So finally, so DO is the last dividend that was paid. Then G is the constant growth rate. G is the constant growth rate. Then PO is the current market price per share. F is simply the flotation cost. F is meant to be the flotation cost. So we have said that DO is the last dividend that was paid. D1 will be the next dividend to be paid. So this particular DO is the last dividend that was paid. D1 will now be the next dividend to be paid. So some question, they can either give you D1 or DO. We should now be able to understand how to convert them in order to get the cost of the ordinary share. So now I'm only showing you how to calculate the cost of the ordinary share. In case it is constant dividend growth rate ordinary share or 0 dividend growth rate ordinary shares. So that was now about number 1, ordinary share capital. That was about the ordinary share capital. Now we go to number 2 as the retained earnings. We now go to number 2 as the retained earnings. We now go to number 2 as the retained earnings. We now go to number 2 as the retained earnings. We now go to number 2 as the retained earnings. So when it comes to the retained earnings, we can first summarize that it is the internal source of finance. It is the internal source of finance. It is the internal source of finance, which will not attract. It is the internal source of finance, which will not attract the flotation cost, which will not attract the flotation cost. Therefore, the cost of the retained earnings, therefore the cost of the retained earnings is the same as, therefore the cost of the retained earnings is the same as the cost of the ordinary share, is the same as the cost of the ordinary share. It is the same as the cost of the ordinary share, except that there will be no flotation cost, except that there will be no flotation costs, except that there will be no flotation costs. Then we proceed by noting that it is calculated as follows. It is calculated as follows. It is calculated as follows. So we have said that the cost of the ordinary share is, or the cost of the retained earnings will be the same as the cost for the ordinary share, but now there will be no flotation cost. So we start afresh, we start with the A. We can have down there as F. So A, we can say that in case of, we can say that in case of zero dividend growth rate ordinary share. We start with A as in case of zero dividend growth rate ordinary share. We start with A as in case of zero dividend growth rate ordinary share. So the formula for the cost of the retained earnings will be KR, like that. But now there will be no flotation cost. So we have stated that the cost for the retained earnings is the same as the one for the ordinary share. The only difference, it has no flotation cost. So we repeat the same formula for the ordinary share, but for the retained earnings, I use KR. KR is the cost for the retained earnings. The same procedure, dividend per share divided by the current market price per share, but we just express it as a percentage. Because now there will be no flotation cost. That's now the first formula on how to get the cost for the retained earnings. Now we go to B. B, we shall also say that in case of constant dividend growth rate ordinary shares, in case of the constant dividend growth rate ordinary shares, in the case of the constant dividend growth rate ordinary share. So the same procedure, KR will now be also the cost for the retained earnings. All the procedure will remain. We only delete the flotation cost in each formula. So now our KR, which will be the cost for the retained earnings, will now be summarized in that order. Will now be summarized in that order. We shall now be able to summarize it in that manner. So the cost for the retained earnings is the same as the one for the ordinary share. The only difference now, we simply exclude the flotation cost. That's now the concept behind the cost of equity. Equity has two components, ordinary shares and retained earnings. So their cost of capital will be calculated in the same way, but for the retained earnings, there will be no flotation cost. So that is now number one, which was the cost of equity. That was now our number one, which was meant to be the cost of equity. Now we go to number two as the cost of preference shares. We now go to number two as the cost of the preference shares. We also check how we can be able to calculate the cost of the preference shares. How we can be able to calculate the cost of the preference shares. So to compute the cost of the preference shares, I will also simply show you the formula of calculating that. So now to get the cost of the preference share, it will be the same as KB. So KB is now the cost of the preference share. It will be given by D divided by PO, we minus the flotation cost. Then we express it as a percentage. So D is the dividend per preference share. D is simply the dividend per preference share. PO is the current market price per share. F is simply the flotation cost. We also express it as a percentage. So that is now the cost for the preference share. That now will be able to give you the cost of the preference share. It should now be able to give you the cost of the preference share. So now we go to number three. Number three was cost of debenture or bond. Let us now go to number three as cost of the debenture or the bond. Cost of the debenture or the bond. The cost of the debenture or the bond. So under the cost of the debenture or the bond, we summarize that it is classified into two categories. It is classified into two categories. It is classified into two categories. Roman letter 1, irredeemable debenture. Roman letter 1 will be irredeemable debenture. Irredeemable debenture. So I'm only giving the formulas on how to get that cost. So KD will be the cost of the debenture. So it will be equal to interest, then 1 minus the tax rate. The current value for the debenture minus the flotation cost. Then we also express it as a percentage. So to calculate KD is now the cost of the debenture. It will be equal to, so this one will be interest, then in brackets 1 minus the tax rate. We divide by, this is the current value of the debenture. The current value of the debenture. Then we subtract the flotation cost. Then we also express it as a percentage. We also express it as a percentage. So to calculate the cost of the debenture, which is irredeemable, simply get the interest in the brackets of 1 minus the tax rate, divide by the current value for the debenture, subtract the flotation cost, then express it as a percentage. That's now the Roman letter 1, irredeemable debenture. Roman letter 2 will be redeemable debenture. Roman letter 2 will now be redeemable debenture. Redeemable debenture. So under redeemable debenture, we summarize that the cost of this debenture, is also known as the yield to maturity. The cost of this debenture is also known as yield to maturity. The cost of this debenture is also known as yield to maturity, and it is expressed as follows. And it is expressed as follows. And it is expressed as follows. So KD will be the same as the yield to maturity. KD will be the same as the yield to maturity. So it will be given by interest, then also 1 minus the tax rate. Then we add in brackets, the current market value for the debenture, we minus the current value of the debenture, then 1/n. Then you also divide by the maturity. So we shall be able to explain what each one of them will stand for. We shall be able to explain what each one of them will stand for. So to compute the cost of that debenture will be the same as the yield to maturity, which should be given by interest in the brackets of 1 minus the tax rate. Then we add, this is maturity value of the debenture. This one is maturity value of the debenture. This one is the current value of the debenture. So there is maturity value for the debenture, then current value of the debenture. Then 1 minus n. So n is the maturity value. So the maturity period. N will be the maturity period. This n is the maturity period. So to compute now the cost of the debenture, simply take the interest in the brackets of 1 minus the tax rate. Then we add in brackets maturity value minus the current value multiplied by 1/n. So n is the maturity period. We still divide by the same. This is the maturity value for the debenture. This is again the current value for the debenture multiplied by 1/2. Then we shall be able to express them. So we shall be getting to understand them when we apply them in the questions. But for now, I'm simply summarizing those formulas. So that's now all about the cost of capital. Finally, we shall combine them together to make it now the weighted marginal cost of capital. But for now, we shall just get to understand for each. So after that, I also want us to have a brief subtopic as methods of computing constant growth rate. Methods of computing the constant growth rate. Methods of computing the constant growth rate. We now look at the methods of computing the constant growth rate. So under that, we can note that the constant growth rate in the ordinary shares, the constant growth rate in the ordinary shares, the constant growth rate in the ordinary shares can be computed using any of the following methods. Constant growth rate in the ordinary share can be computed using any of the following methods. Can be computed using any of the following methods. So basically there are two. We shall also simply get the formulas on how to calculate them. We shall simply also get the formula on how to calculate them. Roman letter 1 will be compounding method. Roman letter 1 will be the compounding method. Roman letter 1 will simply be the compounding method. So I will not be going into much details because we shall apply them. So to calculate G for that level, it will be equal to N, then Dn divided by Do, then we shall be able to subtract 1. So when we get the question, we shall get to know what is N, what is Dn, what is Do, and also 1 minus G. So what happens at that point? You can be given dividend in period 0 and also dividend in period, let's say 4. So to get the constant growth rate, N will be 4. Then that will be dividend in year 4. This would be dividend in year 0. Then now you just compute it in that manner. So it is just a summary in that order, but we shall go through some questions to see how to get the others. So that's now the compounding method. Number 2 will be retention ratio method. The retention ratio method. The retention ratio method. The retention ratio method. So when it comes to retention ratio method, to calculate G, it will be R multiplied by, we can just have it simplified like that. So to get our G, it will be equal to R. Then so this where R is the retention ratio of the profits. Where R is the retention ratio of the profit. Where R is the retention ratio of the profit. Then this other one is return on equity. This one is meant to be the return on equity. So simply take the retention, R is the retention ratio of the profit. The other one is meant to be the return on equity. The other one is meant to be the return on equity. So now we can also write something brief about breakpoint. Let us also have a brief subtopic as breakpoint or critical point. We can also write something brief about the breakpoint or the critical point. The breakpoint or simply the critical point. We can also write something brief about the breakpoint or the critical point. So even for that, we can summarize that it is the point of financing. It is the point of financing. It is the point of financing. Sorry, just a minute. So we can proceed on that. You are saying that it is the point of financing. It is the point of financing where a given component source of finance, where a given component source of finance is exhausted, where a given component source of finance is exhausted, so that the investor uses the next expensive source of finance. It is the point of financing where a given component source of finance is exhausted, so that the investor uses the next expensive source of finance. The investor uses the next expensive source of finance. It is normally computed as follows. It is normally computed as follows. It is normally computed as follows. So breakpoint, the breakpoint will be equal to amount to raise. Amount to raise. Then you will divide by the weight. The weight. So when you want to compute the breakpoint, simply get the amount to raise from a given component source of finance. Divide by the weight. So the weight is the same as the proportion. That weight will be the same as the proportion. But we shall get more when we go through a question. So now I want us to get a question to summarize those details that we have covered. So we can check the question for September 2021. We can now check the question for September 2021. Question number 4, part B. We can check the question for September 2021. Question number 4, part B. September 2021. Question number 4, part B. We can check September 2021. Question number 4, part B. Mine is on page 16. I don't know on your side. Others, 16 others? 11. Yeah, so some people it is on page 16, others is on page 11. Others it is on page 11. So I want us to go through the question. That question is September 2021. September 2021. Question number 4, part B. The question reads that Dynasoft Limited. Dynasoft Limited. You found the question. Yeah. Dynasoft Limited. Capital structure which is considered optimal. Which is considered optimal is given as follows. Which is considered optimal is given as follows. So debenture capital. Debenture capital, they have given you 25 millions. Reserves is 15 millions. Then ordinary share capital is 45 millions. They have also given us the preference share capital. Then additional information, note number 1. The firm's historical earning per share and the dividend per share over the last 5 years is given as follows. So they gave you the year from 2016, 17, 2018, 2019, and 20. So what you do, that 2016, you label it as DO. 2016 will be DO. 2017 will be D1. 2018 will be D2. Then 2019 will be D3. 2020 will be D4. So the first one is always period 0. So that means N will be 4. N will be 4. The first one is period 0. So when we shall be using the compounding method to get the constant growth rate, our N will be 4. Then D4 divided by DO. From the formula I've just given you about how to get the constant growth rate. So that note number 1 will be assisting you to get the growth rate in the dividend. Then we shall be able to see how to apply it. The note number 2, the company ordinary shares currently sells at 50 shillings per share at the securities exchange. New ordinary shares will be sold at this price. So our 50 is PO. You remember in the formula I gave you PO. PO is the current market price per share. So that is now our PO. Then note number 3, the company expects net income for the year ending 31st December 2020 is 40 million. So Dynasoft Limited adopts a constant payout ratio of 40% as it is dividend policy. So if they pay out 40%, they retain 60%. So to get the amount for the retained earnings, we shall be getting 60% of 40 million. That will be the amount for the retained earnings, so that we use it to calculate the breakpoint for the retained earnings. That amount to raise will be the 60% of that value. Then, when you want to get now the weight, retained earnings is part of the ordinary, so it's part of equity. The retained earnings is part of the equity. So when you go up there, you have been given ordinary share capital 45%, reserves are also part of equity. So it will be 45 plus 15. So you take 15 divided by 100. You see the total is 100. So retained earnings is part of equity. So that weight for retained earnings will be represented by equity. So you take the 55, is it 45 plus 15 will be? Is it 60? Yeah, so it will be 60 divided by 100, which will be the same as 0.6. So that weight will be 0.6 for the retained earnings. Because when we get to the required, they will be asking you to calculate the break point. So we shall see how we shall be able to use the same. Then note number 4, the company can raise additional capital as follows to finance the acceptable investment projects. So equity capital, they are saying that utilize all available retained earnings for the year ended 31st December 2020. Any extra equity will be raised through the issue of the new ordinary shares at a flotation cost of 10%. Then also preference share capital, where they say that new preference share capital shall be issued at 11% coupon rate. Then the bar value of each is 100. So new preference shares will be issued at par, subject to a flotation cost of 5 shillings per share. Debentures. New debentures can be sold at a coupon rate of 13%. The debentures will be issued at par. Then note number 5, the corporate tax rate is 13%. So now required, Roman letter 1, you are to calculate the break point in the marginal cost of capital schedule. Roman letter 2, weighted marginal cost of capital in each of the intervals between the break point. Then Roman letter 3, Dynasoft Limited has the following potential investment opportunities. So project initial cash outlay and internal rate of returns are given. So there is V, W, X, Y, and Z. They gave you the total initial cash outlay. They have also given us IRR. So now required using investment opportunities schedule, advise on which project to accept and hence determine the firm's optimal capital budget. So optimal capital budget will be the total cost of the accepted projects. The optimal capital budget will be the total cost of the accepted projects. So to get the accepted projects, we compare IRR and Wmcc. IRR is the return. Wmcc will be the cost. So any project whose IRR will be greater than Wmcc will be accepted. So that's now what we should be required to come up with. So we start off with the Roman letter 1. How to calculate the breakpoint. How to compute the breakpoint. So to calculate the breakpoint, we only compute a breakpoint where they have specified the amount to raise. We only calculate a breakpoint where they have specified the amount to raise. So there are 2 of them. One of them is the retained earnings, which is given under equity capital, Then they continued and said that utilize all the available retained earnings. Any extra amount will be raised to what? The new ordinary share. But we only calculate a breakpoint where they have specified amount to raise. The only place they identified was the retained earnings. So we need to compute the breakpoint with respect to retained earnings. With respect to retained earnings. So amount for the retained earnings. We want to get the amount for the retained earnings. So the amount of the retained earnings, so we are only computing the breakpoint with respect to retained earnings. So amount of the retained earnings, amount of the retained earnings, amount of the retained earnings, you go to the note number 3. Note 3, they had said that the company expects net income of 40 million in the note number 3, but the dividend payout ratio is 14%. So amount of the retained earnings will be 60%. 60% of the 40 million will be the 60% of the 40, because they pay out 40%. So they are retaining 40% of. So net income is the same as they take their net profit. Net income will be the same as the net profit. So that should be how much? It will be 24 million. So it will be 24 million. Also, we need to get the weight of equity. We also need to get the weight of equity. Weight of equity in that capital structure. The weight of equity. So you simply add reserves and the ordinary share capital. We simply add the reserves. Reserves is part of your equity. It is normally reserves, retained earnings, and ordinary shares. So you add, you can see in the capital structure, there is 45 millions plus 15 millions. Then divide by the total. The total is 100 millions. The total is 100 millions. So what proportion is that? Equity in relation to the capital structure. What proportion is there for equity in relation to the capital structure? So when you do that, it will be the same as 0.6. It will be the same as 0.6. So breakpoint is supposed to be given by, the breakpoint will be given by amount to raise. Amount to raise. Then we divide by the weight in that manner. So amount to raise from the retained earnings, you go now under note number 4, where they say that equity capital, utilize all available what? Retained earnings. So we take the full amount that we have calculated for the retained earnings, which is 24 million. So we take the 24 millions as the amount to raise to utilize for the retained earnings. Then we divide by the weight. So the weight is this what we have just calculated as 0.6 in the capital structure. In the capital structure. So that now will be able to give us what is supposed to be the breakpoint for the retained earnings. The breakpoint for the retained earnings. So you simply take the amount to raise, then you divide by the weight in the capital structure. So that is the only breakpoint that you are to calculate. Remember, a breakpoint is only calculated where they have specified the amount to raise. There is no other place in the question they have specified the amount to raise, except that part of the retained earnings. So it was only one breakpoint in that question. But some other questions, we shall see equity, debentures, and also preference shares. Because under this one, when you go to that equity, they say that any extra equity will be raised through what? Issue of the new ordinary shares. They have not specified that amount of the ordinary shares. You see that point? So we cannot calculate where they have not given you a breakpoint. When you got the preference shares also, they never gave you any amount to raise. So we cannot be able to calculate. The same case for the debenture. We only compute a breakpoint where they specify amount to be raised. So for that question, it was only for the retained earnings. That should be now our Roman letter 1, where you are to calculate the breakpoint in the marginal cost of capital schedule. So that is now our Roman letter 1. So yes. Sorry? The 24 millions. We calculated over there. The 24 million we calculated. It came from the note number 3. You can see the note 3. Yeah, The net income is 40 million, but they pay dividend of 40%. So they retain which proportion? So it is 60% of the 40 million. Yeah. So that should be now our Roman letter 1. So we need now to go to the Roman letter 2. We need now to check the Roman letter 2. So Roman letter 2 should be the weighted marginal cost of capital. But before we get WMCC, we need to get the cost of the ordinary share, retained earnings, preference share, debentures. We combine them together to give us WSCC. So we shall come up with that. Yeah. Those who are going for the prayers in Azang Sangapi. Mesha fika time. So I give you how many minutes? 10 minutes. Okay, so we can go for a short break, then we come back exactly at 7. Then we continue from that.
Fine.
Just two lanes now, simulate. Wow. I can miss out. Yes, yes.
So we start with computing the constant growth rate. We shall start off with calculating the constant growth rate. So we start off by computing the constant growth rate. So to compute the constant growth rate, so we calculate the constant growth rate, whereby G is supposed to be given by N. So Dn divided by Do minus 1. We use the compounding formula to get the constant growth rate. So I had already asked you in the note number 1 that 2016 will be DO, 2017 was D1, D2, D3, and what? D4. So which means that our N will be 4, then also D4 divided by D4, then you minus 1 by it. So our G will now be 4. So D4 is the dividend per share in the year 2020. D4 is the dividend per share in the year 2020. So are you able to see in the note number 1, 2020? What have we been given as the dividend per share in the year 2020? Yeah, so we shall be taking 3.6. We divide by DO. DO is the dividend per share in the year 2016. They gave you 3. So now we shall subtract 1. So that should give us the constant. That should be able to give you the constant. So after calculating, we shall express it as a percentage. After we have calculated, we shall be required to show it as a percentage. So you compute, you give me the figures. You calculate, then you give me the figures. We compute, then you give me the balance. You are guessing which figure? 3.38. Yes. So it can also be given by this matter. So 3.60 divided by 3.0. Then raise that to the power of 1/4. So it can also be calculated this way, whereby you take 3.6 divided by 3, then raise to the power of 1/4, then minus 1. So compare what you are getting the same figure, so that we settle now on the value. It can also be calculated this way. Remember, if you don't get it right, then the remaining part of the question will be affected. So if that G is not correct, then whatever we shall do will affect the entire question. So we must get it right at that level. So most of the time, I would prefer you to do this. So go to your calculator, you take 3.6 divided by 3.0. Then after dividing, your calculator has this power. Are you able to see that power on your calculator? Yeah, you press that power, open the brackets, it has it, then 1 divided by 4, you close the brackets. Then get the answer. So the answer you get, subtract 1 and see it will give us which value. Sorry? When you express it, you multiply by 100. .046. So when you express it as a percentage, you could give us 4.6%. It is 4.6 recurring. 4.66. 4.66.
Yes.
Okay. Others, we are together at that point. We are not. I said if you don't get it right there, the rest will be history. Just go to another question. Because finally you will not get it. So can we start together? Those who are saying they are not able to get it. So can you use this formula? So take 3.6 divided by 3. Have we divided that? So put the equal sign, give me the answer. For equal sign. 1.1. So on your calculator, this sign, press that. You have pressed that sign. Then your calculator also equal function. You have opened the brackets. You have opened the brackets. Then 1 divided by 4. You close the brackets. Then press the equal sign. You get the answer. You have gotten the answer. Then subtract 1. Subtract 1. What do you get?
0.0466.
Multiply by 100. Yeah. Napata ngapi?
4.66.
Yes. So you can round it off to 4.67 as a percentage. We can round it off to 4.67 as a percentage. So also learn how to use the other formula. Because here doesn't matter but remember to use spot. Because this one is easier. The other one is a function on your calculator, where some people, after some time, you forget. But you learn how to use spot. So are we okay at that point online? Is it fine at that point? Because if you don't get it right, whatever comes after that will be affected. So are we all getting online? You give me your figures. None of you has given me the value. None of you have given me the value. So when you practice, you become perfect. So don't just write what people have given me. Also calculate yours. We see what you'll be able to get. So I've seen 4.6635. It is exactly 4.6635. Then we can use that one because it is only so that we become real. Amesema it is 4.6635%. Ama inarika. That's the exact one. Inaendelea. After 5, there is another one. Then we can just have it as 4.66 because the other one is 3. That we round off into 2 decimal places. So that we can now have it as 4.66. That's now our growth rate. So after calculating the growth rate, now we want to calculate the cost of capital for each source of finance. After we have calculated the growth rate, we now come up with the cost of capital for each source of finance. So to compute the cost of capital, to calculate the cost of capital, we shall start with number 1, cost of the ordinary share. So the retained earnings. I'll start with the cost of the retained earnings. I'll start off by calculating the cost for the retained earnings. So this one has a constant dividend. In the formulas I gave you when we started about the cost for the retained earnings. So KR represents the cost for the retained earnings. It is supposed to be given by DO 1 plus G divided by PO. Then we add G. I had given you a summary of those formulas. The one with the constant dividend growth rate ordinary share, whereby it ended up being D1 divided by PO, then you add G. So that is meant to be our KR. Then another thing I would also like you to remember, I say that now when it comes to this point, DO is the last dividend that was paid. D1, I said, will be the next dividend to be paid. So don't take your DO in G to be there. Don't take our D1 is noted to be there. So we have said that DO should be the last dividend that was paid. D1 must be the next dividend to be paid. So in the note number 1, they had stated that the firm's historical earning per share and dividend per share over what? The last what? 5 years. So the last year in that pattern is 2020. You see that part?
Yes.
So 2020 is now the last dividend that was paid. So our D1 must go to 2021. That will be now our D1. Yeah. I want you to note that because some people get confused, whereby the DO, when you calculate G, we use the past. But when we are calculating the cost of capital, we go to the future. So our DO is the last dividend that was paid, which is 2020, because that pattern is for the last 5 years. Among the last 5 years, the last year was 2020. So D1 should be the next dividend to be paid. It will be in the year 2021, because the last dividend paid was 2020. So when you will be calculating our KE, this one will be your 2020. So that D1 is now 2021. You get to understand that part, that our DO is the last dividend that was paid. D1 is the next dividend to be paid. Yes.
I have an issue. I really do with DO and D1 now. When we just be submitting the figures there, then can we using D1 there, which is
yes,
we know the growth rate because they are coming.
Yes.
But, according to me, I prefer we use that one because we have DO as 2020, which we have to be 3.6.
Yes, that's what we are explaining.
So, if you explain, it becomes somewhat complicated.
No complication. I've simply stated that D1 is what? So next to be paid. DO is the last that was paid. So go to the question. It is for the last 5 years. So among the last 5 years, which is the last year? Yeah, that is the simplest way I have explained it. So it is not complicated at all. What you should do is that remember that D1 is the next I want to pay. DO is the last that I was paying. You see that? Yes. So the history of the pattern is that the last 5 years, there is 2016, 2017, 18, 19, and 20. So all those years I was paid.
But this is impossible. I use the other one because now that we have paid, we can get D1.
Yes.
By taking 2020 DO. Add 1 plus the 1 4.
So even if Nataka to compute, that's not much. So coming here, I know DO is my dividend in the year 2020, which is 3.66. Now 1 plus G. G is the constant growth rate. We calculate, we got 4.66. So 4.66 when you divide by 100 is the same as 0.0466. Then now we divide by PO. So PO is in the knot number 2. PO is in the knot number 2, where they say that the company's ordinary shares currently sells at how much? So our PO is 15. Then we also add G, which is 0.0466. So that's now what you should be able to come up with as our cost of the retained earnings. That now should be able to give you the cost for the retained earnings. So that should be able to give you the cost for the retained earnings. The cost for the retained earnings. So once you have calculated, multiplied by 100 to convert it into a percentage, multiplied by 100 to convert it into a percentage. Inakuja with percentage. 12.2. You can have it into 2 small places. So it just becomes 12.2. Yes. Yeah. So our cost for the retained earnings is 12.2%. So the next item, number 2, we shall calculate the cost of the ordinary share. So number 2, we need to compute the cost of the ordinary share. So number 2, we shall be required to calculate the cost of the ordinary share. So cost of the ordinary share will also be given by KE. So the same format, DO in the brackets of 1 plus G divided by 3O. But now we factor in flotation cost. We now factor in the flotation cost. Then we add G. So the same that we have done in the other part, it is now D1 also divided by PO minus F. We add G. So you already know DO is 2020. It was how much? Because the formula just remained the same as the one for the paid earnings. The only item you have subtracted is the protection cost. So when you go back to the question, our DO still remains 2020. That DO is still remain 2020. This will be 2021. So that our DO, it is 3.6. Then 1 plus G. G was 0.0466. So our PO still remain 50. But now you go to the note number, sorry, note number 4. Are you able to see under note 4, where they stated that utilize all the available retained earnings for the year ended 31st December 2020. Any extra external equity will be raised through the issue of new ordinary shares at a flotation cost of what percent? 10% of the issue price. Others are 5%. Come on, 10%? 10%. Yeah. So we get 10%, 10% of the 50 shares, because that is now the price. So 10% of the 50 should be, it will be 5. So your flotation cost is 5. Then you also add 0.0466. Then also express it as a percentage. We also express it as a percentage. Shall also show that as a percentage. We also represent that as a percentage. $13 points. Yeah, so that is now the cost for the ordinary share. The next one should be the cost of the preference share. We shall also be required to calculate the cost of the preference share. So number 3 will now be the cost of the preference share. So our number 3 will be the cost of the preference share. So cost of the preference share is KB. It was D divided by PO minus the flotation cost. Then we show it as a percentage. Then you have to show it as a percentage. So to calculate the cost of the preference share, it will simply be D divided by PO minus the flotation cost. Then we express it as a percentage. So we go under the preference share capital. We say that new preference shares will be issued at 11% coupon rate. The bar value of each share was how much? So dividend, we need to calculate the dividend. So dividend, you simply get 11%. 11% of the bar value, which is 100. 11% of the bar value, which is 100. Then PO is the issuing price. PO is the issuing price, which is the same as the current price. So they continue to say that the bar value of each year is 100. But new preference shares will be issued at what? At par. So the par value is the same as the issuing price. So PO is the current price, which is the same as the issuing price. But the question has said that it will be issued at par. You see that par. So the par value of the share is how much? 100. So that means our PO is the same as our par value. We say that PO is the current market price, which is the same as the issuing price. But now for the question they have said, it is the same as the par value. The shares were issued at a price, which is the same as the par value. So the par value is the 100. So our PO will be also the 100. But some question will give you a different figure. If they give you a different figure, you use that different figure that was given as our PO. Then they have also given you F as the flotation cost, where they have said that it will be issued at par subject to a flotation cost of how much per share. So now after that, we can come there to get our PO. So it will be 11 divided by 100 minus 5, then express it as 11.58. Yeah, so that is now the cost for the preference share. That now will give you the cost for the preference share. The next one will be now the cost of the debenture. The next one should now be the cost of the debenture. So let us also get the cost of the debenture. The next one should now be the cost of the debenture. So our Roman letter 4 will now be cost of the debenture. So that debenture, they have not given you the maturity period. When they have not given the maturity period, it means it is irredeemable. When it is redeemable, they will say that it matured on this date. But when you check under the, they only say that new debentures can be sold at a coupon rate of what percent? 13%. The debenture will be issued at par. They have not specified the maturity period. If they don't specify, it means that is irredeemable debenture. But if they specify to be redeemable debenture. So when the question remains silent like that, that one is irredeemable. So I gave you the formula on how to get the cost of redeemable debenture. It was KD should be equal to interest 1 minus the tax rate divided by the current value of the debenture. Subtract the flotation cost. Then we express it as a percentage. We express it as a percentage. So KD will be given by interest, then 1 minus the tax rate, then current value minus the flotation cost. So we know that to calculate interest, it is supposed to be given by the coupon rate. Coupon rate has been given as what percent? So we normally take 13% multiplied by the par value. Do you remember the interest rate is calculated on the par value? Yeah, so it will be 13% of the par value. The par value has not been given. So we just have it as 13% of what? The par value. Then current value is the same as the issuing price. The current value is the same as the issuing price. So they also specified it was issued at that's more that one line. The debenture will be issued at par. So the current value is also the same as the par value. Rotation cost is not given, which means it is what? At 0. So you just come there, you take KD. So to get interest, I've said it is 13% of what? Of the par value. Like that. Then 1 minus what? The tax rate. So the tax rate is given as what percent? 30%. So 30% is the same as 0.3. Then we divide by our current value is also the same as what? The bar value. Flotation cost is 0. So you simply cancel those. Like that. So finally, we are 13% of 1 minus 0.3. So finally, we will come up with 13% of 1 minus 0.3. Because it was issued at par, then interest is also calculated at the bar value. Whether it is given or not given, you just take that interest rate, then tax it to give you the value for that question. So we shall get to which figure, because it is expressed as a percentage already. It is already a percentage. So it is what value? 9 point. You get 9.1%. Yeah. So that is how you are to get the cost of that debenture. Yeah. So you get the cost of the debenture on the basis of that. So when the figures are not given, just get to understand the explanation. It was interest is calculated on the bar value and it was also issued at a bar value. So the two bar values will cancel off. Will only be left there 13%, but it must be after the tax. So that is now the cost of our debenture. So once we have that information, we want now to compute the Wmcc. We want to see how to get the weighted marginal cost of capital. So we combine them together, but now we calculate at the breakpoints. We calculate them at the breakpoint. So to compute our Wmcc, to compute our weighted marginal cost of capital, you need to get a summary of some information in relation to that. So in our summary, we need to get some details. So we start with equity. I will do a small summary about equity. I will do a small summary about equity. So we had calculated the breakpoint. We had calculated the breakpoint. You remember the breakpoint for the retained earnings? When we started the question, we calculated the breakpoint. So how much was the breakpoint for the retained earnings? So it was 40 million. Then another item, I also want you to give me our KR. We have just calculated KR. Costs for the retained earnings, 12.2. Then also give me our KE, the cost for the ordinary share. 13.0. Then, so that is now equity. The other source of finance is the preference shares. The other source of finance is the preference. So preference shares, it had no breakpoint. We did not calculate the breakpoint for that. But we had calculated KB. The cost for the preference shares, we got to which figure? 11 point. It was 11.58. Then the other source of finance is the debentures. So even the debentures, it had no breakpoint, but we calculated KD. Remember our KD? We got 9.1. Then after that, we also need to get the range. We also need to get the range, summary for the range. So when it comes to the range, the first one normally starts from 0 to the lowest breakpoint. The first range will be from 0 to the lowest breakpoint. But the question had only one breakpoint, isn't it? So which means it is 40 million. So the first range is normally from 0 to the lowest breakpoint. But this question had only one breakpoint. So that one breakpoint is now the one which is the lowest. So we start from 0 to 40 million. The second one will be now above 40 million to the next breakpoint, which is not there. What we do, we go to Roman letter 3. You can see the Roman letter 3. Get the total cost of those projects. Get the total cost of those projects. So can you add 10 million, 20 million, 10, 20, and 10? It will give you a total of how much? 70. Yeah, so we can only spend up to 70 million. So the next range will be above 40, but up to the maximum amount required for all the projects. But if it had another breakpoint, you start from 40 to the next breakpoint. If there is another one, you start again number 3 from that breakpoint to the next. So it goes in that order. But for this question, it had only one breakpoint. The first range will start from 0 to 40 million. The other range is now above 40 million. But now you put there a ceiling of the total cost of all the projects you want to do as to evaluate. So that is now the summary of the information we will be able to have. So once you have summarized that, we want to compute WMCC. WMCC, we get the weight of equity, cost of equity. You add the weight of the preference shares, the cost for the preference shares. Also the weight of the debenture, the cost of the debenture, which must always be after the tax. So to get our weighted marginal cost of capital, we are combining equity, preference shares, and debentures. But we factor in the weights are the proportions which you are given. Remember the proportions up there in the capital structure. Now, debenture, it is 25 million divided by 100. You see that paragraph? So 25 divided by 100 should be 0.25, isn't it? Then equity, you remember it was reserves plus the ordinary share, and it was 60 divided by 100, which gave us 0.6. Then for the preference share capital, it is 15 also divided by 100, which will be 0.15, isn't it? So those are the weights for equity, weight for the preference share, and the weight for what? The debenture. But we compute for each range. We compute for each range. There are 2 ranges that we have there. So we shall calculate for the 2 of them. So my first range will be from 0 to 40 million. My first range will be from 0 to 40. So the only breakpoint that existed was under equity. You see equity. 40 million and below under equity, we shall be using the retained earnings. Above 40 million, we will change to what? Ordinary share. Because retained earnings have been exhausted. Yeah. There is only one. We say that a breakpoint is where a given source of finance is exhausted or actually fully utilized. You change to the next source of finance. So equity, there are 2, retained earnings and ordinary share. The breakpoint for the retained earnings was 40 million. So remember the 40 million. So if it is between 0 to 40 million, that's retained earnings. Above 40 million, we go to ordinary share. And that information is given to you under equity. You can see under equity, use all available retained earnings for the year ended 31st December 2020. Any extra equity capital will be through the issue of the new ordinary share. So once you exhaust the retained earnings, you go to the ordinary share. So when we shall be calculating, this KE here is not referring to the ordinary share, it is referring to equity. And this part is equity. This part is the preference shares. This one is what? Debentures. So under equity, anything to do with 40 million and below, you only retained and above 40, ordinary share. Yeah, so we get that part. Yeah, because we have two of them, 0 to 40, you only retained earnings. Above 40, doesn't matter now, we're going to change to what? The ordinary shares. So we make it in that arrangement. So we are on 0 to 40. So to calculate our W, these others, they have no breakpoint. They will apply to all of them. They will apply to all of them because they have no breakpoint. But where there was a breakpoint, we specify each to go to its range of the breakpoint. So our Wmcc. So the weight for equity, we said it was 45 plus 15 divided by 100, which was 0.6, which was 0.6. So we are on equity. Under equity, anything to do with the 40 million and below, you use the retained earnings. Anything above 40 million, you change to the ordinary share. So we are 40 million and below. So that area we use retained earnings. Whose cost of capital is 12.2. So here we multiply by 12.2 like that. Because under equity, anything to do with 40 million and below, you use the retained earnings. Anything above 40 million, you change to the ordinary shares. I hope that point is clear. Yeah. Yes.
That's 0.6
equity. Yeah.
So equity is
this one we must specify what number 4. Equity capital, preference share capital, and what? Debenture capital. There are 3. Equity, from your knowledge, there are 3 items: retained earnings, ordinary shares, and reserves. So it has covered the 3 items. So 60% represent equity. In which percent? Preference share. When you take 15 divided by 15% represent preference shares, which means the other one is 25% to be debentures. That's now the proportions of the weight. So we have concluded that is 60% is representing what? Equity. But we have said that anything to do with the 60 million and below, you're retained, and retained and is part of equity. Jamana not near you for retained and it's in this range, in that part of the range. Then, yeah. Any other question?
If we have some because we were some reserves to form
and the retained earnings is not there. So what means? The simple concept is that equity has how many items? So the proportion you get, it represents equity. So anything that will be on retained earnings, you use the same proportion. Anything for the ordinary share, you use the same proportion. If there is reserves, anything for the reserve, you also use the same proportion. There are only 3 components: debentures, preference share, and equity. So I cannot narrow down because even they have not specified it. So we generalize that source of finance. It is like this class. See in section 5 of the pre. So atakuwa still section 5. But you have represented the whole of the class. It is the same issue. We shall now check for this. It is equity. So one of them must represent equity, retained earnings and the ordinary share. So we are calculating the WSEC. It is now our section 5. But now who is representing equity? Under 0 to 40, it is retained earnings. When we shall be above 40, ordinary share is the one to be representing equity. So that's now the issue. So let us go to the preference share. Preference shares, it is 15 over 100. You see the 15 over 100? It will be 0 point what? 0.15. So there was no breakpoint for the preference. It will apply to all of them. So ilikuwa nini? 11.58. Then we go to the debentures. Debentures, it is which proportion? 25 over 100 is also the same as 0 point. So your KT is the cost of the debenture, but it should always be after the tax. So if figure it is already after tax. So we just use it as 9. Just use it as 9. It is already after tax. So you add them together to give you WMCC within that range of 0 to 40 million. Within that range of 0 to 14 million. Because they were asking you weighted marginal cost in each of the intervals between the breakpoints. There was only one breakpoint from 0 to 40, then above 40. Those are the only 2 intervals that we have. So after that, we go to the second one. Second one is now above 40 millions to the next high. So next highest is the same as the total cost of all the projects, because there was no other breakpoint, which was how much? 70 million. So now we also calculate the WMCC. We should now also be able to get the WMCC for that level. So WMCC for this one, the proportion for equity still remains 0.6. Then you come back under equity. You see 40 million and below was the retained earnings. But now we are above 40. So when you go above 40, change to the ordinary shares, which is 13 point. Yeah, so this one with equity will be 13.03 like that. The rest, they will not change if they had no break. So this one will also be 0.15, more like 11.58. Also, this one will be 0.25, also not 9.1. So those are the 2 WMCC in the intervals between the breakpoints. In the intervals between the breakpoints. In the intervals between the breakpoints. So that should be your Roman letter 2 of the question. The WMCC in each of the intervals between the breakpoint. Between the intervals in the breakpoint. So once you have finished that, we now go to the Roman letter 3. So Roman letter 3, they were asking you using investment opportunity schedule, advise on which projects to accept and hence determine the firm's optimal what? Capital budget. So I said we compare WMCC and IRR. IRR is a return. WMCC is a cost. Any project whose IRR would be greater than WMCC, it will be accepted. Any project whose IRR will be less than WMCC will be rejected. So IRR is a return. WMCC is because we compare the 2. Any project whose IRR is greater than WMCC is what? Accepted. Any project whose IRR is less than WMCC is rejected. So in your analysis, First, you rank the projects according to IRR. You first rank the projects according to IRR, but they have arranged in that same order. You see the one with the highest, it is B. Second highest is W. Then X, Y, and Z. But other questions, they mix them. They can maybe give you B as 8%, isn't it? And maybe they give you W as 14. And they give you X as 16. You see that part? Yeah. So first of all, rank them according to what? IRR. The one with the highest IRR, you rank it as number 1. But for this question, they are already ranked in that order. The one with the highest IRR is the one which was the first one. So in that schedule, we summarize it in this manner. We summarize it in this manner. So in that schedule, we shall simplify it in this manner. So what you do, you will be having the column for the project. We shall have the column for the project. Then the cost. Also, total cost. The total cost. Then IRR. Then also Wmcc. Then we make the decision. We make the decision like that. So we prepare our schedule in that order. We start with project cost, total cost, IRR, Wmcc, and also the decision. We arrange it in that manner. So we have the project, the cost, the total cost, IRR, Wmcc, then finally we make our decision. So we start with the one you ranked as number 1. So we know the one ranked as number 1. Is which project? B. According to IRR, B is the first one. And it was given how much as the initial cash outlay. So the cost is 10 million. Your total cost is the cumulative one. Our total cost is the accumulated one. So far, there is no other project. It is only what? B. So cumulated will still remain what? It will remain 10 million. So total cost is the cumulative one. Then what is the IRR? IRR is 16. So to identify Wmcc, we use this total cost. So it is 10 million. Yes. Go back to the previous part of the 10 million is between 0 and 40. 10 million is between 0 and 40. So between 0 and 40, what was what the Wmcc? 11.332. We can just have it as 11.33. So now you can see IRR is greater than Wmcc. So that one will be accepted. So you accept. This IRR is greater than Wmcc. So that one we accept. That one we shall be able to accept. The next ranked will be which one? According to the IRR. Always make sure that you rank them according to I. So for this question is also the same as W. W requires how much? So cumulative so far, it will be 30 million. So IRR is given us 14. So we use 30 million to identify Wmcc. So 30 million is still between 0 and 40, which will be what? 11.33. So even this one, IRR is greater than Wmcc. So that one we also accept. That one will also be accepted. The next rank will be X according to their order. So X requires a cost of how much? 10. So cumulative 40 million. So your IRR is what percent? 11. So 40 million is the figure between 0 to 40. So our Wmcc is still what? So this one, IRR is less than that. It is very clear. So it is very simple there. Yes. IRR is less. So you reject. That one will be rejected. IRR is 11%. But Wmcc is what? 11.33. Yes. You just compare the two. Just compare the two. So that one will be rejected. IRR is less than what? Wmcc. The next rank should be which one? We got Y. So Y, you can see Y required how much? 20 million. So cumulative will be 60. So IRR, you are given what percent? Yeah, so 60 million is above 40 to 70, isn't it? What was the Wmcc when it was above 40 to 70? 11.8. So even that one is obviously rejected. IRR is less than Wmcc. So that one is also comment rejected. Finally, the last one is Z. So Z, it had an initial cost of, then cumulative should be, so that IRR is given as 8. So 70 million is still above 40 to 70. It is 11.8. Yeah, so even this one, IRR is less than the Wmcc. So we have rejected project X, Y, and Z. So in your recommendation, we have accepted B and W. The projects that we have accepted is B and W, and then rejected X, Y, and Z, and then rejected X, Y, and Z. So that will be your Roman letter 3. But still, in that Roman letter 3, after they had said that, advise on which project to accept and reject. Also determine what? Optimal capital budget. So let us write something brief about the optimal capital budget. We write something brief on the optimal capital budget. So we note that it is the total amount. It is the total amount or cost. Is the total amount or cost of all the accepted projects. It is the total amount or cost of all the accepted projects. The total amount or cost of the all accepted projects. So we have accepted B and W. What is the total cost? 10 plus 20 is 30. So i.e. 30 million. Yes. Okay. We just add 10 plus 20, which will be 30 million. So optimal capital budget is the total cost of the accepted project. So that will simply be 30 million. So that is now on that question. So I will still be doing at least 2 more questions on the same in our next class before we move out of that. The only challenge with that part, you see, it is carrying how many marks? Sometimes it carries full 20 marks. Sometimes we shall be getting those questions. So here it was supposed to carry 14. Yeah. So if you make a slight mistake in any of them, it will be able to cost you. So we shall get some other 2 more questions in our next class before maybe we move out of that area. So for now, time is up. We can just stop there. When we meet, we shall do some other questions. So the recorded will be shared tomorrow. It cannot be converted now and be shared. So you will hang on until tomorrow.